Ravi, I guess both medicine and the provision of medicine is changing, obviously pretty dramatically, as is access and effectiveness. How do you think your organization is going to look 3 years from now?
That's going to be a difficult one because we're not sure what's going to happen in the next couple of months. But one thing that's critical, we see that access is becoming more difficult. The humanitarian space is becoming tighter and tighter and smaller. With the wars, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's difficult for us to access some of our patients as well as some of the doctors that we're working with. Now, one thing we've been working on, and I hope that over the next couple of years it will improve, is the provision of consultations using telemedicine, which is something that's commonly used here in the US, but hardly ever used anywhere else. And we've tested that in Iraq, and it worked very well between the US and Iraq. In Afghanistan, the bandwidth couldn't afford it, couldn't handle it. But also at the same time, training, because our organization, International Medical Corps, focuses on training and building the capacity of our local counterparts. Training using technology, be it video conferencing or the internet, is something critical for us. But also, again, as a medical first responder, like any business, we rely on information and good information and timely information, especially when we talk about emergency response. If the information is going to come to us 2 weeks later, God knows how many people would have died by then. So the adequate and timely information is critical, and we're hoping over the next 3 years that will improve a lot, where everybody would be feeding information into one site, be it the UN agencies, private sector, citizens, the nonprofits, as well as the military. When they go in, they have access to information, and we don't know what happens to that information. And that information could be used to really make a huge impact on people's lives.
Alan, how about you? As you think about the provision of feeding people will never, the need to feed people will never change, but how will your organization change over the next 3 years?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, the trends against which I see those changes developing against. One is, I think, the pattern of disaster and humanitarian response over the next 3 to longer years is increasingly going to be influenced by climate change. I think we're going to see, unfortunately, the bands of areas where particularly rain-related climate change are going to come are already the most vulnerable areas of the world. And we're going to see increasing effects there. The other trend that I think we have to cope with is the fact that governments want more control over what goes on in their territory and relief. The idea, the days of the UN and the NGOs flying in, the government's basically issuing them blank check and letting them, except for making sure they didn't go into insecure areas and spy on them, is over. They want more control. They want to do more with them. I think where technology is going to change us and where I think the environment's going to be different is in a couple of areas. One, I think the diversity of tools that we're going to have to respond to food needs. The capacity to use vouchers, to do market analysis means that food assistance doesn't have to be the delivering of a bag of grain. It can deliver vouchers, it can deliver cash in some circumstances, it can be used to provide purchase and access to food, and I think you're going to see, even in emergency settings, not just in transitional development settings, more use of a wider range of tools, some of which will be facilitated by technology. I think you're going to see a lot more focus from a different kind of technology. We've talked a lot about the internet and data, but from the evolution in food technology and particularly micronutrient fortification, you're going to see a lot of change in the products that food aid does. For anybody who does food aid, you do grains and pulses, and there's this one universal product, which amazingly we've been using for 20 years for supplemental feeding for children, which is called corn soya blend, or CSB. And we just know a lot more about how to build products that address a wide range of nutrition needs. I think you're going to see an explosion of efforts in food technology and in new products, of which the private sector is already playing a critical role, the private sector food processing industry. I think the third area that is inevitable, and technology will play a role in doing it, is a lot more focus on monitoring and results. The humanitarian business often is what somebody has described, I think I used the quote once, but I'm not sure, management by anecdote. the good story, the compelling picture. And then when you start counting things, you count outputs. How many tons I delivered, how many people I reached, how many people came to my clinic. But we all know that the real issue is how better did their health get? How better is their nutrition? It isn't how many people we processed, it's what help that processing did. And I think this is the area that I think coordination can do the most good, because the types of surveys and material that you need to develop to figure out what's happening with the community is too much for any one organization. I mean, we've done it when people start putting metrics in. You know, and I mean, the Afghan villager says, you know, the guy here was yesterday to ask me about what water was and how my water was doing, and you're here today asking about my food, and the guy will be here tomorrow asking about my medicine. I mean, we're going to have to combine this. It's also costly because it's basically people power. It's not, and let's face it, this business, the humanitarian business, is biased toward, well, how much do you get the maximum dollar for the good? I mean, you know, for what you're delivering. I mean, we face this challenge in the food assistance. We want better targeting. We want more efficient targeting, but when we do that, we spend more on development, the design of the project, we reduce the number of beneficiaries, and then somebody says, but the dollar cost per ton of food, you're now spending 60 cents of the dollar instead of on non-food. Well, some of that is to make sure that the food is used more effectively, and I think that we're going to have a lot more focused on results monitoring, and I think there's a lot that can be done in processing information there, and I think that is the weakness of humanitarian action, is that we still don't have enough effective monitoring of how you count the results rather than you delivered the goods. I mean, that's kind of, I mean, I can tell you how many tons and how many beneficiaries were reached. It's a lot harder to measure the impact, particularly since it interacts with everything else. I mean, you know, that's the dirty little secret. You know, the health is affected by the food, and the food is affected by the water, and all of this is affected by peace and conflict management, and therefore people are reluctant because they could be doing their part perfectly well, and if the other part isn't working, their, quote, results will look bad. So output is what people want to measure, because that's the kind of thing they can sort of control. Outcomes are more interactive and more challenging. But the only thing, I'm probably taking too much time, the other thing that's sort of one risk of the technology is if you think there are 300 today, there'll be 3,000 tomorrow. Because with the internet and with technology, the cost of entry to become your own NGO serving one school in Haiti and raising funds directly on the internet are huge. And the one-man NGO, the quick movement, the in and out, that has no sense of that context, no sense of that history, may not want to be coordinated. That, I think, has been a challenge for the last 10 years of humanitarian work and will continue to be a challenge because the technology allows more diversity, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does create fragmentation, and I think we're managing fragmentation is a big challenge in the humanitarian business because, you know, coordination is, I'm a lot with my colleagues, I think it's sometimes oversold. You know, in no other part of the world do we think that socialist state planning is the way to go, but we seem to think that everything is perfectly coordinated and no one competes with anybody and everybody divides the market up. This is going to make the most effective humanitarian operations, and I'm not sure it does.